There's a dangerous skill that many women develop over the years. We become incredibly good at keeping everything running. We manage the household, handle our careers, we show up for the people we love. And by 9 a.m., we've already disappeared from our own priority list. Our lives may look entirely put together from the outside, but inside, we feel like we're barely keeping up with an endless checklist. If you've ever wondered how happiness fits in when your life already feels completely full, you're in the right place. In this video, we are stopping that cycle. By the end of this conversation, you will have a completely new blueprint for measuring your day, one that will give you back hours of guilt-free space every single week without having to wait for your demanding life to calm down first. My name is Linda, and I am the founder of Wise Women Wellbeing. I work with women over 50 who are incredibly capable, deeply caring, and wondering why life doesn't feel the way they hoped it would be by now. And one pattern comes up again and again. I see them saying things like, I'll focus on me after this project, after the holidays, after everyone else is okay. And the problem is that life rarely becomes less demanding on its own. If your well-being always has to wait until your calendar finally clears, you're asking happiness to arrive at a time that may never come. So if this sounds familiar, I hope you'll stop measuring yourself against an impossible standard. The problem isn't that you don't care about your well-being. It's that you've been following a strategy that asks you to postpone your happiness, your own well-being until life gets easier. So again, today we're going to stop treating happiness like it's something that begins after your responsibilities end. Instead, we're going to replace I'll be happier when with a way of practicing happiness while your real life is happening. And that's exactly what the happiness compass was designed to do. I spoke about that in the previous video, and we're going to revisit it a little bit more here. It's going to help you make small 3-degree course corrections instead of waiting for one dramatic life change. And it begins with the first of 3 daily bearings. So maybe you've noticed this pattern. You wake up with the intention of taking better care of yourself today. Maybe you'll finally go for that walk after dinner. Maybe you'll spend 10 quiet minutes with your coffee. Maybe you'll start reading that book that's been sitting on your nightstand. But then real life shows up. Someone needs something, an email comes in, work gets busy, dinner has to be made. One responsibility turns into another, and by bedtime, you're telling yourself the same thing you've been saying for weeks. Maybe tomorrow. There was a period when, I struggled with something similar. I was juggling 2 part-time jobs while trying to build Wise Women Wellbeing. And every day felt like moving from one responsibility to another. If you asked me whether I was happy, I honestly wouldn't have known how to answer that question. I wasn't miserable every minute, but I wasn't building the life I wanted either. I was simply trying to keep everything moving. Now, one of the most remarkable things about the human brain is that it adapts. We adapt. If something happens often enough, that begins to feel normal, even if that situation isn't serving us. That's why so many women stop noticing that they've postponed themselves. Postponing happiness and well-being has subtly become our default setting over time. And it's not like, the danger isn't that you're going to wake up tomorrow and you're going to feel dramatically worse. The danger is that when you postpone yourself and it becomes so normal, 5 years can pass before you realize you've become incredibly good at managing your life while slowly losing touch with the person you wanted that life to be for. And that's why we need a different way of measuring our progress. So earlier I mentioned the happiness compass. As I mentioned prior, A compass doesn't tell you that you've arrived. It simply tells you whether you're moving in the direction you want to go. And the same is true for happiness. So instead of asking, you know, you know, or saying, I just want to be happy today, I want to move toward happiness, I want to be happy, I want you to start asking a different question. And that is, which direction am I moving today? Just like a compass uses bearings to help us navigate, I use 3 daily bearings to help me practice happiness in my day-to-day life. They're simple, they're practical, and together they create small course corrections that add up over time. So let's start with the first bearing on the happiness compass, and that's energy alignment. Most of us have been taught to think about energy in, I don't want to say the wrong way, but in a way that can sometimes trip us up. We treat energy like a phone battery. We just keep going and going and going like the Energizer Bunny until we're almost empty. And then we hope a vacation, a long weekend, or finally getting through a busy time will somehow recharge us. The problem is that life doesn't really work that way. There's always another deadline. There's always another responsibility. There's always going to be another person who needs something from you. So if you're waiting until life becomes less demanding before you restore yourself, you may be waiting for a time that never arrives. And that's why I teach restoration. I don't focus on recovery because there's an important difference there. Recovery happens after you've become depleted. Restoration happens while you're living your life. And that distinction changes everything. So behavioral scientists have been studying something called micro restorative interventions. They found that brief periods, sometimes, maybe 3 to 5 minutes of intentionally stepping away from demands throughout the day can lower our baseline of stress more effectively than trying to recover all at once at the end of the week, like on a Saturday. In other words, your brain responds better to small, consistent moments of restoration than to running on empty for 5 days and then hoping the weekend's going to fix everything. And there's another reason why this matters. Again, we are very adaptable. Our brains are adaptable. If we spend months or years living in a state of constant depletion, we eventually stop noticing it. Feeling tired becomes normal. Feeling emotionally stretched becomes normal. Even living with a constant sense of pressure begins to feel like that's simply what adulthood is supposed to feel like. So psychologists describe this cumulative impact, allostatic load. It's the wear and tear that builds when our minds and bodies stay in a prolonged state of stress without enough opportunities to recover. It isn't one difficult day that changes us. It's hundreds of regular, maybe stressful, maybe chaotic Tuesdays. So here's the shift I want you to make. Stop asking yourself, how much can I get done today? And start asking yourself, how am I allocating my capacity? And what I mean by that is recognizing that your energy is a finite source, finite currency. Every conversation, every text message, every demand from family members or friends or whatever is a withdrawal. Not necessarily a bad withdrawal, but it's a withdrawal. If your day is nothing but withdrawals, you are trying to build a joyful life from an emotional account that's been overdrawn for a decade. That's why the practice for this bearing is intentionally simple. When that afternoon wall hits, it usually does around 2 or 3, your instinct may be to go get some coffee, check social media, or try to push harder. Instead, try this. Create one micro sanctuary every day. Not an hour, not a weekend retreat, just one uncompromisable moment of restoration. Again, 3 or 4 minutes. Maybe it's before your afternoon meetings. Maybe it's sitting in your car after work before you drive home. Maybe it's walking outside without your phone. Maybe it's closing your office door and allowing yourself to consume absolutely nothing for those few minutes. One of my clients, actually, we were working on having her balance a demanding corporate role while helping her adult daughter through a high-risk pregnancy. When I suggested restoration, she kind of laughed and she said, Linda, I don't have an hour for a bubble bath. And I said, good, because that's not what I'm asking you to do. So instead, she agreed to commit to 4 minutes every afternoon before walking to her next meeting, or she would sit in her car, put her phone away, close her eyes, and just allow herself to stop producing for a minute, maybe a couple minutes. And then within 2 weeks, she told me that her afternoon anxiety had dropped dramatically, not because her circumstances changed, but because her relationship with those circumstances changed. So then let's move on to the second bearing on the happiness compass, and that's active boundaries. When most people hear the word boundaries, they immediately think of saying no. But that's not actually what I'm talking about here, because you can say no to somebody and still feel guilty. You can protect your time and still feel resentful. This bearing really isn't about boundaries per se, it's about alignment. It's about making sure your daily actions reflect the values you say matter most to you. Many women in the Wise Women Wellbeing community deeply value love. They value connection. They value being supportive. And those are beautiful values. But under prolonged pressure, something subtle begins to happen. Those values slowly drift. You start to drift away from your values. So support becomes rescuing. Connection becomes people pleasing. Responsibility becomes over functioning. And eventually, we're no longer acting from our values, we're acting from habit. So, family systems psychologists have studied a pattern called overfunctioning. It happens when one person consistently takes responsibility for solving problems that other capable adults could solve themselves. But over time, something unintended happens. One person becomes increasingly responsible, and the other person becomes increasingly dependent, and therefore neither person grows. So occupational psychologists see a similar pattern through something called role overload. As we accumulate more and more responsibilities, we don't simply become busier, we gradually lose the mental and emotional capacity to engage with our own lives. And that's where resentment quietly begins to grow, because we're living out of alignment with the very values we were trying to honor. So here's the shift. Helping someone isn't always the most loving thing you can do. Sometimes trusting them is. Sometimes respecting their ability to figure out something is. Sometimes allowing another person to experience the natural consequences of their own choices is the greatest act of confidence you can offer them. And that's what I mean by active boundaries. You're choosing empowerment over control, mutual respect over people pleasing, long-term growth over short-term relief. So I call that practice the clean handoff. It's the moment when you feel the urge to jump in, to fix, to rescue, to take over, and instead you intentionally hand the responsibility back with kindness and with trust. And it might sound something like, I know you'll figure this out. What do you think your next step should be? I'm here to talk it through with you if you need to, but I trust your judgment. Those are boundaries. And they're also invitations for someone else to grow. Let's move on to the next bearing, which is curious interruption. One of the biggest misconceptions about happiness is that it disappears because our circumstances become difficult. That's certainly part of the story, or it can be part of the story, but something else is happening too. When we're under prolonged stress, our world begins to shrink, not because there are fewer possibilities, but because our brains stop seeing them, right? We just stop seeing possibilities. So think about this. Have you ever noticed how on a stressful day, everything starts to feel a little inevitable? Like, I have to do this. I don't have a choice. I just need to get through the day. Those thoughts feel true, but they're usually a sign that you've shifted into what I call functional endurance. You're still functioning, still getting things done, but you're no longer actively choosing your life. You're simply enduring it. And this is a common theme that I talk about a lot. And there's a reason that this happens, right? Under prolonged stress, like I said, our brains naturally stop developing what some psychologists describe as tunnel vision, or they start to develop tunnel vision. It's the part of our brain responsible for planning, creativity, flexible thinking. It becomes less accessible because our brain is prioritizing immediate survival. Our attention narrows, our choices appear to disappear. We stop asking what is possible, and we start believing that the way things are right now is the only way they can be. Researchers studying cognitive appraisal theory have found something fascinating. The simple act of interrupting that automatic reaction with a question of curiosity helps re-engage our brain, particularly the analytical part of our brain. So instead of reacting automatically, we begin evaluating. Instead of feeling trapped, we begin noticing options. This is what psychologists refer to as psychological flexibility, the ability to remain present with difficult thoughts and feelings while continuing to choose actions that reflect your values instead of your fear. And that's an extraordinary skill, and it's one that we can strengthen through practice. So here's the shift. The goal is to allow or to stop allowing stressful days to make decisions for us. Agency, the ability to make decisions for ourselves, rarely returns through one dramatic decision. It usually returns through one small intentional choice. One moment when you interrupt the automatic pattern and ask a better question. So this is the practice I call the pivot point. And you know you've reached one because your body is going to tell you. You know, you may feel that your shoulders are tight, your jaw may feel like it's clenched. You know, you may find yourself sighing a lot. Those aren't just signs of stress, they're cues, and they're invitations to pause instead of automatically pushing harder. When you notice those cues, just try this. Take one slow exhale and make sure you can hear that exhale. Allow your shoulders to drop. And then ask yourself what I call the future self question. And it could sound like this. I can't control this chaos right now, but what is one micro choice I can make in this moment that serves my future self and not just my current stress? We're simply widening our field of vision to see one choice that we couldn't see 30 seconds ago. Here's an example of this in practice, right? One woman I worked with dreaded every Thursday afternoon, right? She spent a lot of time caring for her elderly mom before rushing home to cook dinner. By the end of the night, she was absolutely exhausted. And that every day became something just to survive. And one week she reached her pivot point. She noticed that tightening in her chest. She noticed that her shoulders were feeling tense. And then she stopped and she asked herself that future self question. And almost immediately she realized something. Her future self didn't need a home cooked meal on that particular day. She needed a little peace. So she ordered takeout instead. Now, nothing about her mom's health had changed. Nothing about her responsibilities disappeared, but everything about how she experienced that particular evening changed because she had reclaimed one small piece of agency. So I know we've covered a lot. If you've been listening to this and recognizing yourself again and again as I've been describing this, again, remember there's nothing wrong. You're feeling this way because prolonged pressure changes the way we think, feel, and move through our lives. Everything we've talked about today makes sense. It makes sense that you've accepted, or you may have accepted, depletion as normal, as if it's been normal for years. It makes sense that your values may have drifted if you've spent decades responding to everyone else's needs. It makes sense that you stopped seeing choices if your brain has been under prolonged pressure. None of those patterns define who you are. They're simply patterns you've been practicing, and patterns can change. So before we finish, I'd like you to try something with me. Just for the next 30 seconds, stop trying to solve your whole life. Whatever problems you're facing, try to not solve them, right? Instead, ask yourself 3 simple questions. What do I need right now? What really belongs to me in this moment? What's one small choice my future self would thank me for? That's what it feels like to use the happiness compass. Not about finding all the answers, it's just simply asking better questions. So imagine what begins to change when checking your bearings becomes as normal as checking the weather before you leave the house. You stop waiting until you've become completely depleted before paying attention to yourself. Life probably doesn't become less demanding, but you'll move through these demands differently. And that is precisely why I don't expect you to figure out this framework in isolation. You don't have to break a 20-year habit of overfunctioning all on your own. So look at how far we've traveled today. We've started by recognizing that happiness isn't something you lose all at once, something you just quietly drift away from, right? But by learning how to align your energy via these micro sanctuaries, practicing the clean handoff with your boundaries, and using your pivot points to choose agency, you are officially taking the wheel back. If that still feels like a lot to take in on a random afternoon, just remember, you don't have to fix your entire life by tomorrow morning. This isn't a massive project, and you don't need to turn your world upside down to be successful. Direction matters far more than speed. And in my world, slow is still progress. So if today's conversation helped you recognize yourself, recognize aspects of the situation that, you may be falling into, let's create a little space to think about your life differently. Every week I set aside a few openings for what I call Spark Reconnection sessions. It's simply a private 15-minute conversation dedicated entirely to you. We'll look exactly where you're leaking energy right now. We'll map out your very first 3-degree shift, and then we'll, see what you'd like to build for yourself for the future. The link to claim your session is right below this video. Remember, take it one step at a time. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.